So today I'm very excited to introduce my guest, Justin. Justin, I will not give a huge introduction, but I will actually just let you introduce yourself. So go ahead and thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Justin Kaeser. I work at JetBrains on the Scala plugin for IntelliJ. Um, I don't know what to put in these introductions.
Whatever you want to put in him. No, how about you just give a little backstory of, actually, I'll give you a few different questions that you can answer right away. So maybe a little bit of backstory about how you got into programming, what got you first interested in tooling, since we'll primarily be talking about tooling, and then maybe how you got started with JetBrains.
Right. Okay. Backstory and tooling. So basically, whenever I started working on a project at a company, uh, it turned out the way things were running wasn't quite as smooth as I'd like. So I'd get kind of fed up with that and start trying to fix it. So, like at a previous company, I was working. Um, yeah, I was starting to work with Scala. It was 2012 or so. So the Scala tooling ecosystem wasn't very developed yet. Um, and like everything was just kind of causing blockages, like from the IDE. We were at first using Eclipse and the build tools, like there was SPT 2.9 or so, if anybody remembers that. Um, the CI servers, like at first we didn't have one, then we tried Jenkins. I wasn't really happy with that. So Uh, well, the company as a whole was more working on semantic analysis of news bits and trying to generate some knowledge graph out of that and support traders. Uh, the actual building the actual parts, yeah, there was a major challenge in keeping things running, redeploying, and so on. And so I basically just picked up the slack and started implementing like code style checkers, CI tooling, look for a proper CI server, and like we were just a relatively small startup, like maybe 30 people, but we had an interesting code base. Like today, big companies like mono repos, but back then we had dozens of small projects that you could describe as some proto microservices, but they had to work together with different uh, in the correct versions and be deployed together with correct versions. So that was challenging from the tooling side, and I just started to work with that and
Okay.
trying to get things working a bit smoother.
Okay. So I'll take a step back then before that. How did you get interested in programming? Did you always like programming? Did you go to school for programming? What was like sort of like your first step into that world?
Well, for one, my father's a programmer, so I was
Okay.
exposed to it kind of at an early age,
Okay.
but I didn't really get into it before university.
Okay.
Like I was a bit aimless in my young years, and one day a friend called and she said, "Hey, Justin, let's study computer science," and I was like, "Okay." Um, and
The rest was
and it,
history.
it turned out I kind of liked it and wasn't horribly bad at it. So
Okay. Okay. Also, I'll take one like second, and I forgot to mention this when I did an introduction. But if people do have questions at all during the interview, don't hesitate to just drop them in the chat, and I have like a little bot thing that will be watching for them and will capture them. So if you do have questions, don't hesitate, and then we'll potentially get to them if we have time. But to jump back to what you were saying, so you were doing programming. That's how you got started. You started at your first company, which then got you interested in tooling a little bit. So then where does JetBrains fit into the picture? Like, how did you start at JetBrains and your work with IntelliJ?
So that's actually connected to that first company.
Okay.
So yeah, I was looking for good tooling, namely a CI tool. Jenkins was really not cutting it for us because we had like this massive collection of repositories that we had to work with, and Jenkins didn't allow, at the time at least, any automatic way of configuring these projects in a consistent way. You had to copy paste, and every time you changed something you had to copy paste again, and things would be immediately out of sync. So I looked for a better build tool. I found TeamCity from JetBrains, which also happened to have some basic Scala support, basic SBT support. And I had a question about the SBT support, so I just commented on the blog post that introduced it, and the developer who wrote the blog post got in touch with me. And we exchanged some emails, and she noticed, oh, we're working on the same street, literally.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, our office is on the same street. So we just decided to get together and have some chats.
Nice.
Which we did once in a while.
Okay.
Now, fast forward like 2 years or so, like the startup had kind of gone dead. I had switched to another company, but I wasn't really happy there. So I just got in touch with her and asked her if there's some opportunities at JetBrains. And as it happens, there were, like, someone who was working on the SBT support had just recently left. So I just filled that space.
Okay. And you've been working on it pretty much ever since, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay.
Like it's a very, worthwhile.
So normally I ask people this question right away in the beginning, and I joked about it with you earlier a little bit, but yeah, what is like your personal preference in tooling? Like normally I always ask, what editor do you use and why? So just for sake of continuation, I'll ask you the same question. Justin, what editor do you use and why?
Clearly VS Code.
Yeah, okay.
So that I know what the opposition is up to.
Oh, opposition! You can't pit us against each other like that.
Yeah, what's the English word?
Rivalry? I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. The alternative. It's just an alternative. That's what I like to say.
Yeah. What alternatives there are, but usually I only use that for like quick editing tasks when I want to just open some other folder somewhere.
Yeah. But
day to day, obviously, I do dog fooding. We're big at that. We're big into dog fooding at JetBrains.
Okay. And what is it about IntelliJ that really drew you to it as both an editor and an IDE, I guess?
Well, at the previous company, at the startup, at first I was using Eclipse.
Yeah.
And we were having pretty serious problems with that in Scala because like completions would sometimes take 20 seconds and it'll crash or not show highlights. I don't even remember what the problems were, but it was not fun to use. I tried IntelliJ once. Like highlighting wasn't working so well. So left it for a while, but then I returned to it half a year later or so, and things had gotten much better. It was usable with SBT.
Yeah.
You still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I just noticed I was lagging a bit, so I cut my video to you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I just had started using IntelliJ as the default editor, but obviously there were still problems with it.
Okay.
But by the time I got to JetBrains, which was like 2016, July 2016, things were already a lot better. But yeah, as you may remember, the SPT support was working, but still also had its issues. So yeah, as always with tooling, I'm not entirely happy with it. So I start working on things that I'm not so happy with and try to improve them a bit.
Was there anything from like your early Eclipse using days that you miss now that you're on IntelliJ? Like, was there anything that you felt like Eclipse did a really good job at?
That I now miss? No, not anymore.
Okay, was there one thing that like they set the bar
Like
for that
when,
you
when
needed to
when
do?
I initially switched, I missed some things like uh yeah, like initially the highlighting still wasn't sufficiently good. It would not show errors all over your project, so you'd only see like the local errors or something. But I
Okay.
think that's mostly all taken care of some time ago already.
Okay. So I want to ask you a whole bunch of questions about IntelliJ, but I feel like before I can really do that, I also need to talk about some of the other projects you're involved in. One of them being the build server protocol, which we also use on Metals, and there's also other tooling that uses it. So for those that are maybe unaware, can you give like a little introduction to what the build server protocol is?
Okay, so um, basically the build server protocol just gives you a standard protocol to connect build tools such as SBT or Mill or Maven or whatever with IDE or front end or a language server such as Metals. And the motivation for me to get into this was that, yeah, I had already worked on SBT some 2 years or so.
Yeah.
Uh, and there were some efforts to support other build tools. Initially, like we had an intern working on CBT, if
Okay.
anybody remembers that.
Chris's build tool.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The complex build tool.
Compared to the simple build tool. Yeah.
Exactly.
Carry on.
Right. But yeah, so we got some basic integration working, but like immediately issues started popping up, and I figured, okay, if I have SBT, if I'm still working on SBT every once in a while, there's something that needs fixed. The most I could do was support one other build tool.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably wouldn't be some fledgling build tool such as CBT. Because
Okay.
like, yeah, we have teams supporting like Gradle or Maven specifically in
Yep.
IntelliJ. So the Scala support for that basically just piggybacks off of that. But as you may remember, in Scala, we're never quite happy with our build tools. So somebody comes up with a new one every year or so. Maybe that has cooled down a bit. But
Well, that's a good question. That's
innovation there.
Yeah, I actually have a question about that too, about build tooling. Another question I typically ask people is like, what is your favorite Scala build tool, and like, why is that? Like, I know that you work primarily on the SBT integration for IntelliJ, but like, is SBT like your preferred Scala build tool? And if so, like, is it the one you recommend to people? And if so, why?
Yeah, it's my preferred tool for one because I'm just used to it.
Yeah.
I've worked with it a lot. I'm most familiar with it.
Yeah.
So and like it's improved quite a bit in usability.
Yeah.
So I don't really have a reason to go to another build tool.
Mm-hmm.
But as I understand, people are pretty happy with Mill, and there are some applications where Bazel or Pants are a better fit.
Yeah.
But like for my personal situation, that's SBT is just fine.
You mentioned that for a while it seemed like there were so many build tools coming out for Scala or new build tools, but that's maybe slowed down a little bit. like it is something super interesting to me because there does seem to be a somewhat dissatisfaction with build tools in Scala, and that's not a jab whatsoever at any of the current build tools or like the work that has gone into them. Just for whatever reason, people are unhappy with it. So then the question is sort of like, is there space for another build tool ever in Scala, do you think? And
Yeah, sure.
yeah, and it's tricky too because it's funny whenever you see talks of another build tool, you see people complain like, "Oh, not another build tool! Like, are you serious?" But at the same time, there's sort of like this dissatisfaction with build tools, which is interesting to me. Like, yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, I think build tooling is very interesting. So it's a not entirely solved problem. That's why probably people are always dissatisfied.
Yeah,
Uh, like maybe there's also this expectation that I really just want to compile my code and work on my code and not code how to build the code, right?
yeah,
Um, so one thing many people try is making a build tool that is configuration only. And in my opinion, that's kind of doomed because you will always need some kind of specialty configuration, like coded configuration on in any more complex project.
mm-hmm.
So you end up either writing build tool plugins or you that you then configure, or you configure your build directly by programming special procedures, or you end up writing like some hacky wrapper scripts around your build
Sure,
to invoke your build with different parameters. So then you have basically two build tools. You have like bash plus whatever configuration build tool,
yeah.
Maven or so you have, or
That's what I was going to ask. If you can, like, what do you consider a configuration only build tool? Like Maven, I'm assuming, because you said Maven now. But was there another one for Scala that you can think of? And I don't know if you're
uh,
familiar with Seed or not. Like that was
yeah,
sort of a
yeah, I
thing.
think that had that approach.
Yeah, like just a TOML
uh,
file.
I think Fury tried that kind of, but also was programmable. um, yeah, but like I don't think any particular tool has become prevalent in Scala that is not programmable.
Okay. So yeah, so BSP in some ways is aimed to solve in some ways that matrix problem, right? Where you don't have to re-implement in different editors and different build tools that they can share the work, right? And
Yeah,
if I remember the website correctly, the first ones to do that were Bloop on the BSP side, right? And then
mm-hmm.
on the editor side, what was it? What was the first editor that did it actually?
IntelliJ. Yeah.
IntelliJ. Okay, so
Yeah.
now that there's more, like, is this sort of what you were hoping for and what you were expecting to see, like more and more adoption? Because I believe there's also some other languages that are potentially looking into using it as well. If I understood some
Yeah.
of the things that, like, what's the
So
future of BSP?
yeah, so right now basically every Scala build tool that is in use sort of supports BSP,
Mm-hmm.
and you're able to fairly quickly implement some basic BSP support if you're like developing a new build tool, and then get some basic IDE support out of the box.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, what I'm looking into right now, yeah, is expanding the language support and the build tool support. So I've had like, so I haven't myself worked directly on them, but I've worked with a bunch of interns who did most of the heavy lifting there.
Mm-hmm.
Like the mill BSP support was initially contributed by one of my interns, Alexandra Dima. And over the last year, the Basil BSP support has been worked on by several interns. We get the names together. There was Andre Hosha and Andrzej Guszak and Marcin Abramovich and Magda Augustinska and Gerard Droszcz, if I got those names right, most of them Polish, who worked on that as part of their bachelor's thesis.
Mm-hmm.
So they got the Bazel support working to a high degree with support for not just Scala, but also some degree Java and Kotlin.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great advance for Bazel support in IntelliJ as such, because that's always been plagued by the official Bazel plugin kind of being a version or two behind the IntelliJ version.
Yeah.
And also, as I gather, it doesn't really support the mapping Bazel project properly to the IntelliJ project structure.
Yeah.
And so that's mostly solved, I think. And I think we support some of the major features now that are necessary for larger projects.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So like some of the things that popped in my head that I'd love to pick your brain a little bit on is maybe some of the differences between how different editors are using BSP, because for example, like Mill is interesting to me because they have their own BSP implementation as well that IntelliJ can use, right? And I believe it works quite well. But I know on the Metal side, we actually don't officially like support the Mill BSP implementation because there are like some things that don't quite work for it on the Metal side. And the reason that's a little bit interesting to me is because I feel like IntelliJ also sometimes will do things a little bit differently than Metals does. Like, and I'd love to like chat a little bit about some of those differences. And one of them that comes up right away that I think a lot of people will ask about is the presentation compiler, because like Metals, for example, we use the Scala presentation compiler. IntelliJ, if I understand it correctly, uses its own like internal representation of the presentation compiler, correct?
Not quite correct.
Okay, correct me. Educate me.
So this is not really the area I work in, but
okay.
I can give you the overview. Like, so IntelliJ internally doesn't compile at all. What we have a representation of the program structure,
okay,
the AST, if you will, but more rich than just a compiled AST. It's called PSI, the Program Structure Interface, and that represents not only the raw AST, but like editor positions, and there's types in there, and so we do have our own type checker that runs on top of that.
Okay.
Right. And so, yeah, if you're asking about why we get like false positive error messages, there are some mismatches in our own representation to what the Scala compiler does.
Yeah.
For probably various reasons.
Yeah.
So maybe sometimes we don't completely follow the same logic as the Scala compiler. Sometimes because it's maybe a bit underspecified, or maybe sometimes, often it's just a bug.
Yeah. I think I saw a tweet from you sometime in the last like week even, where you mentioned that the next version of IntelliJ you'll actually have the option to use the official presentation compiler. Did I see that right?
Not the presentation compiler, but yeah. So the next release is coming up next week about.
Okay.
That's 2021-2.
Okay.
And yeah, one of the features we added is being able to use the regular compiler for highlighting your code. So this is similar to what Metals does with BSP.
Yeah.
Actually, we have two ways of doing it. So we have our own compile server historically, which we use to compile code. And that one's, if you enable this switch on a regular project that is not BSP, then it will use the built-in presentation compiler, regular compiler.
Sorry, now I've stuck that in your head that I said presentation compiler.
To to get the compiler messages, errors, and warnings, and then just highlight them there in the code.
Okay.
So yeah, if you have problems in your project with false positive highlighting, then you probably want to enable this option. The other way is doing it over BSP. So in that case, we just outsource the compiling to the BSP server, but the result is the same. So the result from the BSP server gets put into the editor, used for editor highlighting.
Is there a future with IntelliJ where BSP will be the default? Because right now you get like the choice, right? So like, how come there is that choice, and why, for example, isn't BSP just the default?
For historical reasons.
Oh wow!
How do you hear that?
Thunderstorms.
Yeah, we've been having thunderstorms like almost every day here for the past weeks, month. I don't know. 2021 is pretty apocalyptic.
Yes.
All around. Right. So yeah. So currently we have the regular SPT support.
Yeah.
And support for other build tools, specific build tools on the one hand, and we have the support for importing them over BSP if they support BSP.
Yeah.
So one reason is, of course, backward compatibility. Not every version of SPT supports BSP. That's fairly recent, and also doesn't support it to the same degree. And if we did it over via Bloop, like Metals does, which we do support, but you do lose some SPT metadata in the process, and sometimes the interaction isn't quite as smooth.
Yeah, you lose access to the entire task graph if you do it that way, right? Yeah.
And to the built-in SPT shell, and so there's some people for whom this is a fine trade-off, but like it's not ready to support as default at this point.
Okay.
But I do want to work on like polishing the BSP support so that it can be used as a default for many build tools, especially for SPT.
Yeah.
And yeah, it does require some more work on some odds and ends, and we'll still probably need to support the other options for backward compatibility, because like many people rely on that. We're not quite as greenfield as Metals was, at least.
Yeah.
I guess it's not anymore.
We haven't hit 1.0 yet, so I guess we're still beta, maybe.
Right. So yeah, we do have a lot more compatibility maintenance load.
Sure.
I think, yeah.
Plus you have
or
I was gonna say, plus you have a plugin architecture to think about too, right? So like there's more compatibility issues you have to care about, where with Metals we don't have any of that, so we can kind of just change whatever we want whenever we want, more or less.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so midterm, I would like to get to the point where BSP can be the default protocol for communicating with build tools, and like the import would be more or less transparent to the user.
Yeah.
Let's say if you have SPT version 1 point something, then it will use BSP by default, and otherwise use the old way, and maybe somewhere hidden away you have an option to use one or the other. Because there's always somebody who needs.
That brings up a good question, or like a good point too, that I often think about oh wow, it's really storming by you, about like how much of this stuff should actually just be abstracted away and be seen almost as an implementation detail. Because I know for us, at least on the metal side, we get so many questions about, for example, like, well, what is BSP? Like, we have the like a BSP switch command, for example, to switch from Bloop to SPT if you want. And sometimes that's confusing, and it's confusing which one you're currently using or what's the benefits of using one over the other one. Yeah, like sometimes
Yeah,
I personally wish that like I don't even want you to know about it. I just want it to work, and I want you to like yeah. Do you feel that a little bit sometimes that those things
yeah,
should
of
sort of
course.
be just abstracted away?
Like, yeah, of course, people get confused all the time about what does what. Like, compile, presentation compiler. Like, people keep asking us, why don't you just use the presentation compiler? Uh, yeah, we
Like I
have this
did.
whole architecture in the back end that we rely on for all our other features,
Of
pretty
course.
much, that you can't just switch out by switching the compiler.
Hmm. Yeah, of course.
Uh, yeah, and of course I get that with SBT and with SP and so on.
Hmm.
There will always be some edge cases,
Yeah.
or someone poking around, and then or somebody who just runs into some problem that is specific to their configuration and so on.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, for sure. If do you feel like there are some really untapped areas of BSP yet that you just haven't had time to work on, or that yeah maybe just have yeah you haven't had time yet? Like what are the untapped areas of BSP?
So obviously I want to work on a tighter SBT integration,
Mm-hmm.
so that's really mostly transparent and fluent to the user. And I want to integrate it more tightly with IntelliJ, have a dedicated ESP plugin, for instance,
Okay.
so that IntelliJ, even when you're not using the Scala plugin, is able to import BSP projects more seamlessly, automatically,
Okay.
so that it expands the scope of P.
So those are like
Which,
primarily on the integration side. What about the protocol side? Is there any like part of the protocol that you feel like you'd want to further develop, or is like the protocol at this point solid and
like
sort of where it's going to be?
like there's no major thing I want to add at this point.
Yeah.
Uh, but we always run into some something that would be nicer to have differently or to expand. So like obviously language support, but that's like a language by language thing. If we want to support a specific language, we might have to transmit some bits of metadata. But those are protocol wise are fairly minor additions. They're largely a matter of integration, like or build tools and clients to support them.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where the most of the work actually lies.
Okay. The like I know you mentioned that you primarily work on the SPT integration. Have you worked at all in any other build tool integrations with IntelliJ, or has it really only been like the SPT part that you focus on?
I focus pretty much on SPT and now BSP.
Okay.
So
Have
I did some supporting work to have BSP supported in some build tools.
nice.
Though, as I mentioned, that has been largely done by interns I've worked with.
Yeah. It's the
Yeah.
reason I ask is I find it interesting that like somebody who works in tooling like yourself, you use build tools for your own projects, but a lot of the interaction you have with build tools is actually programmatically almost because you're building tooling around it in some ways. So I was
Yeah.
curious, like if there were any examples you maybe had of some type of build tool or tooling that has like a really nice API or that you really enjoy working with, or like yeah, like what's something when I mentioned that comes to your mind, if anything, that you're like, oh, I love this.
Nothing directly. So the only build tool I have some experience with in the guts really is SBT. And well, that was kind of hard to get into, and I wouldn't say have a deep understanding of it, but that's the only one I have some deeper understanding of, really. Otherwise, I've only really scratched the surface.
Okay. One thing that like IntelliJ I feel like is really well known for, and to be honest, it's even something on the Meadow side that when people ask about it, we sort of just point them to IntelliJ instead, is that you guys have like such a good Scala Java interop, where like if you have mixed projects, everything just works. How is that done? Can you like walk through a little bit of how that works? Like how you can like, is there some type of like you mentioned an AST representation in the back end? Like is that like a JVM representation that can be shared between Scala and Java, or like or how does that work?
Yeah. So that's basically the magic behind it, and that's what enabled IntelliJ a longer time ago to support many more languages effectively than Eclipse did at the time.
Mm-hmm.
This program structure interface. So it is a shared interface for program structure. And then on top of that, you have like language specific implementations.
Yeah.
But you have a lot of shared structure between Scala and Java.
Yeah.
So that enables it to pretty much seamlessly jump between Scala and Java definitions or use them.
Okay.
And like just access them from your code and completions and whatever.
Okay. Okay. So I'm curious too. So like, well, I'll try to shift gears a little bit because I'm curious to like, a lot of the stuff we're talking about is, the current tooling in Scala. And one thing that really interests me is sort of like the future of tooling in Scala as well, and maybe you too. But you said something in an interview that really stuck out to me. I like was looking back, I like literally just Googled you and was watching a bunch of your stuff. But one of the interviews you did in 2019 at Scala in the Bay, you mentioned Mathematica and you speak about it and its notebook experience like really positively. Then ask why in Scala are we so far behind this, because Mathematica was so many years in the past. Like, do you still feel that, or do you feel like Scala tooling in the last couple of years has improved, or like unpack that statement a little bit?
I haven't used Scala notebooks much recently because the way they are, what they are supporting is mostly like maybe prototyping, data science, and such.
Yeah.
I found, but like I had a quick look at it and it looks pretty nice. But from what I gather, what you're really missing is the integration with a full development environment, getting the full level of code assistance you get from an IDE, and the exploration and documentation and so on. So one thing that really impressed me about the Mathematica notebook interface was how the documentation for the whole Mathematica API, you could call it, is implemented in the notebook interface itself. So you can look up any function and you get a nice overview of, first of all, what the function does in the abstract. Then you get some nice practical examples that you can run and manipulate right there in the notebook, in the documentation. So it's better than just type check documentation. It's like actually runnable documentation. And that's something I'd really like to see for any mainstream language, but especially for Scala, obviously.
Yeah. Do you feel like MDoc comes close to that? Because I know you mentioned like type check documentation or type check markdown, I guess.
Well, MDoc, and before it, what was it called?
Tut.
Tut, yeah. Yeah, I mean, type check documentation is good to keep your documentation up to date with the actual code. That's a big improvement over what we have in most language ecosystems.
Yeah.
But it's still so far away from actual runnable, manipulable documentation.
What do you mean by manipulatable documentation? That's an interesting phrase for me.
So yeah, in the Mathematica documentation, you look up a function, you get some description and some examples, and you can actually manipulate those examples right there.
Okay.
in the notebook.
So it's almost like your Scala docs. Like you can manipulate your Scala docs almost. Would that be like the closest thing, I guess?
Yeah. but you have the input and the output right there on the same screen.
Okay.
You can mess around with the inputs and see how the output changes, so you can really explore what a function does, uh, right, in context. And
Interesting.
of course, in Mathematica, it has a lot of visualization functions with a lot of options. So it's really interactive, really visual. What you can it really makes it palpable what you can do with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And Mathematica had this, I don't know, 20 years ago,
Yeah, that's crazy
and
to
like,
think about.
yeah, we're only really getting close to it now in mainstream programming languages.
Hmm. So what do you think is like an area of Scala tooling that if it was just like magically better, Scala would be way better?
Uh, yeah, I mean, obviously, notebooks could be further improved.
Okay.
Um, one vague idea, other vague idea I've had would be the editing experience. So, like, we're still kind of manually formatting files and dealing with white spaces and so on.
Okay.
Uh, what I have in mind would be something that makes the manual formatting or the formatting plugins uh, such as, what was it called? Uh,
The Scala formatting plugin?
yeah, Scala formatting,
Like Scala
Scala,
format?
yeah, Scala format, or the formatting built in IntelliJ, whatever.
Yeah.
That kind of obviates that, because like I think that your program has a structure, and your editor should be able to render the structure the way you like it,
Hmm. Like
while
each
you edit it.
individual's person, like the way that I like it and the way
Yeah,
that you like it
the
when we
way
both view
that
it.
you like it.
Ah,
We don't
okay.
have to agree on a common code style, because really our editor should be able to format this the
Hmm.
way we like it.
Interesting. Okay.
Um,
That could be doable, right? Like even with tooling now, like if you would have some type of if you have your own, for example, let's use Scala format as an example. If you would have your own Scala format
yeah,
file and I have my own and we have a shared one that's checked into Git
yeah,
that would
exactly.
format something as simple as that even.
On that level, yeah, I think it's doable, and we could also make better use of like rich text. So like for LaTeX, there's some tools that kind of do this, like licks, that gives you a wheezy whim, what you see is what you mean
Okay.
interface. So you don't get the word style WYSIWYG, that it shows you on the screen exactly what you'll get, but you'll see the structure in nice formatting that's easy to read and work with. So we could have something like this for programming
Hmm.
in principle.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Yeah, there's I found myself recently really thinking about like what's next for Scala, like what's the next not evolution, maybe that's like a cheeky term a little bit, but yeah, like what's the next evolution in tooling for Scala, and like what is that next step, the next thing?
Well, right. Yeah, right. And on exactly, this would be like just a base for what more you can do with it, like structural editing. So, we actually have a tool at JetBrains that allows this, but it's kind of more for specialty tooling, uh, called um, 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 wait, I'm forgetting names here. MPS, yeah, Meta Programming System.
Okay.
So instead of just manipulating text, you could be manipulating the AST directly,
Okay.
and the editor could be giving you much smarter suggestions based on what actually the AST at this point, and disallow, or let's say strongly discourage, entering things that are not legal at this point in the AST.
Hmm.
And then you could be just checking in actual ASTs. So part of this, you actually originally Paul Chisano worked on the editor side of this when he started working on Unison, but I think they since shifted more to getting the backend to work right.
Yeah.
But so you're familiar with Unison?
Well, I was going to bring up something about Unison in a second, so it's funny you brought this up. So I'll wait for you to finish, but yeah, there's actually a point that I wanted to bring up about Unison too.
Yeah. So one of the innovations, relatively innovations in Unison, is that you actually check in an AST into your code base, and when you check it out, it just transforms this into code that you can edit in your favorite editor. But in principle, this favorite editor could work directly with the AST as well.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that, and I apologize if this is wrong because I really don't know much about Unison, but I remember reading about this and it really struck me as something that was very interesting, was the idea of where you put your code. Because I'm not a very, I'm the worst person when it comes to how do we architect this large application to make sure we have the correct packages here or there and where you put stuff. And to be honest, I just don't care that much. I just create a directory and I want to throw all my files in there and I want to go to them when I want to go to them and see them, but I don't really want to care about the overall structure of stuff. And if I understood what I read with Unison, that it's much more of you just write your code and it stores your code, and you don't necessarily have to worry about where you're putting your files and all this jazz. And that concept I really like.
Yeah, in a way. So the idea is that your code is content addressed. So code, when you check in a piece of code, a function or something, you will check in the AST, and that generates a unique hash. And when you refer to this function, you refer to this unique hash rather than referring to some name.
Yeah.
And that, of course, allows other interesting applications like distributing this code over a network or something. And also having a code base that isn't text-based and managed by Git, but instead is basically a big hash map of code, of functions, of individual functions, and you could use any version of any function at any given time. Of course, then you need special ways of updating usages of functions, but I think they've worked that part out already. Okay. So I'm not actively following Unison, but it's a project I ideologically strongly support.
I think in the future I'll need to talk to somebody from Unison maybe. So if anybody if anybody has a recommendation on somebody that would be really good to talk to about
talk to tooling. Runar or Paul Chisano.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to reach out to them because that would be a fun conversation. So again, shifting gears a little bit, because I also want to talk a little bit about you're pretty active in open source. I've interacted with you before online. I always had really positive experiences, and there was something that actually stood out to me that I made sure I wanted to ask about because it was very different than you normally see all the time. And your GitHub profile says in favor of niceness, and it was simple, and I really liked that. And I wanted you to maybe expand on why you felt that that was important enough to include in your profile.
Actually says in favor of niceness, community, and civilization.
Okay, I butchered. I took part of it, so all of it. Sorry.
Yeah. which refers to an old Slate Star Codex post.
Okay.
Which some people these days might even find controversial, but I really liked the main point of that post. So it kind of argues for improved discourse norms, where like you can disagree with ideological opponents on some things while still being civil, working with them, or even friendly with them in other contexts, rather than basically then turning them into a evil outgroup that you must be destroyed with words or other means. And another point of the post is that it emphasizes like intellectually honest discourse. So if you want to be part of a group and work together with people, not every rhetorical weapon will be permissible. Like if you think the other group is killing people through their ideology, it's still not a good idea to actually make up things about them, like that they eat babies or something.
Okay.
But rather, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I didn't know the
And
full.
that's the basic idea.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for explaining. I didn't know where the quote came from. Kind of related to that, and I guess in the thread of, I guess, just being a welcoming environment in general. Like one question that I always like try to ask the people that I talk to is what do you think we can do to make tooling a more diverse and welcoming environment for those that are underrepresented in this space?
Yeah, that's tough. So I don't really know, you know.
It's all right.
I think we should not make things up about people, and just because we disagree with them or dislike them for some reason.
Okay.
But like if you're talking about like so being welcoming is one thing, but actually attracting a more diverse crowd, as we all know, tooling is dominated by a male demographic, not necessarily white, but definitely male.
I would definitely, I think I'd still say it's a bunch of white males, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, we do know several non-white people who are contributing, but yeah, most of them are white. Sure. I think that, well, for one reason for that might be that where tooling generally draws from the same pool of people that open source generally does, which is exactly this demographic.
Sure.
I've noticed like within JetBrains, for instance, like our male-female ratio is obviously as skewed as anywhere in the industry, but not as much as in the public-facing tooling. Sure. So like I think internally we're about as skewed as the industry average.
Okay. So I mean, maybe
and like some of our top committers are women, so
cool.
Maybe. So yeah, the question is, why do we see only certain type publicly contributing to tooling?
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Like why is it the same types of individuals that are maybe more publicly visible? So kind of like related to that in general is, you know, when I first started getting involved in tooling, I found it to be honest, like a little bit difficult. Not because people weren't helpful. Like I actually found like some of the most helpful people in tooling, but just because a lot of the concepts are like way less covered, and you don't find like when you start with the library, you get a bunch of intro articles and there's tons of stuff about it where you start getting involved in certain parts of tooling and you don't necessarily find those same things. So like how can we just in general make contributing to tooling easier for anybody?
Oof.
Big question. Go.
I think you mentioned the main pain points already, right? Like it's hard to find an endpoint in the first place. I think one thing that's really hard is tooling interacts with a lot of endpoints in different organizations. So I noticed in my work here on the Scala plugin, I've often worked with people from many different organizations as much as I've worked with people within my own team.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the tooling addresses very specific problems that specific people or organizations are having. So I think a lot of the reasoning for why things are the way they are hidden away in like maybe some GitHub discussions or even more privately at some discussion somebody had at a conference with somebody else.
Yeah.
People aren't maybe really motivated to document every little bit because there's only a small amount of people who will ever be working on a specific tool.
Yeah, of course.
Like the Scala plugin is maybe one of the largest single tooling teams in the Scala ecosystem. We have like 10 people, give or take.
Okay.
Varying a little. The Scala compiler team, I don't know how many people are there. I think less than 10.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know of another tool, I guess, that has 10 consistent people that are all working on it at the same time.
Yeah, so within the team, we just usually often share knowledge on demand.
Yeah.
Except for some very basic documentation.
Okay.
And like writing documentation is hard, right? It takes a lot of work. It's not always fun.
Yeah, it's arguably just as hard to write good documentation than it is to write like good code, if not harder at times. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So I think I have pretty much like one more softball question for you, but if you could take the next 6 months of time off and just work on whatever you want, what would you work on?
How about 6 years?
So sure, 6 years. Special question. Take the next 6 years and work on whatever you want.
To a first approximation, I'm already working on what I think is most valuable.
Okay.
But most of the time, that's maintenance and polish of stuff, keeping stuff working, keeping things up to date. But let's say I didn't have that, didn't need to do that, just start fresh somewhere. I really would like to address the notebook question.
Okay.
And actually, I'm working with an intern right now who will start having a look into that. Here, a shameless plug, we have our own notebook tool that we're developing at JetBrains.
Okay.
Called Data Lore, which is focused on data science notebooks, and so far it supports mostly Python and Kotlin notebooks. We're looking into supporting Scala notebooks as well. But that's still mostly just offering a good notebook experience in itself. But what I think they'd have a lot more potential in offering an interface for documentation, like as I mentioned in Mathematica, live interactive documentation would be really valuable.
Yeah.
They could be used for various other things like better debugger interface, like in the debugger run code in cells and like reuse bits of code, or for writing tests. So having interactive individual tests instead of writing a test and then running them separately through some test runner interface, which is often clunky.
Yeah. Okay.
Stuff like that.
So 6 years of work. That's a lot of stuff. Okay.
Probably, yeah.
Is there anything else that you have on your mind that you wanted to bring up that I didn't ask you about, or that you were curious to either give a shout out about or just chat about?
No, not really.
Okay. Well, with that, that's all actually the questions I have for you. But I wanted to, again, just thank you for your time for tonight, just answering a bunch of questions and making time to chat about this type of stuff. I always really enjoy this. Also, thank you so much. Thank you also for your work on IntelliJ. I know it's still the most popular Scala editor out there. So yeah, thank you so much for all of your tireless work to just make the Scala ecosystem have solid editor support. So I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you for setting up this talk thing, because I've been missing going to conferences. And online conferences don't really do it for me. Because there's a lot of the interactivity missing that you get at regular conferences.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I feel the same way, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to be able to do this, to chat with people. Virtually, it's hard to get the, I listen to you speak or something at a conference, or see you at a conference, and we go sit at a table and chat to each other about developer tooling or something. So the fact that I can't really get that, this fills that void a little bit. So I really enjoy it.
Yeah, great idea.
But yeah, so thanks again for making the time. But one thing I also wanted to do real quick is actually introduce the speaker that I'll have next month, which I'm really excited about. So without further ado, I'd like to let everybody know that this next month in August, I'll be sitting down with Eugene Yokota. Be really excited to just chat about SBT and developer tooling and build tools and all sorts of things. So yeah, please do tune in for that. I'm really excited for it. And again, I just wanted to give everybody, wanted to basically thank everybody for tuning in and to always showing up and listening to these. Again, my goal is to really be able to provide some just more insight into the tooling world. We talked a little bit about how difficult it is sometimes to get involved in tooling, how there's maybe not as much intro material out there. So hopefully this can be another another resource or just more insight into it to help people get involved, or to help people, just make more sense of the ecosystem. So with that, I want to thank everybody again for coming and showing up, and thank Justin one more time for coming. And hopefully I will see you all again in another month. So thanks for tuning in, everybody.